The September 11th attacks are often associated with the cities of New York and Washington, but this story actually begins in Boston. At 7:59 a.m., American Airlines Flight 11 takes off 14 minutes late from Logan International Airport in Boston, headed for Los Angeles International Airport. This aircraft was a Boeing 767-200 with 81 passengers and a crew of 11. Among them were 5 hijackers. At 8:14 a.m., just 15 minutes later, from the same airport, United Airlines Flight 175 takes off with a 14-minute delay. The original route was also headed to Los Angeles International Airport. This aircraft was also a Boeing 767-200 with 56 passengers, 9 crew members, and 5 hijackers among them. Meanwhile, at the same time Flight 175 was taking off, Flight 11 was already being hijacked over central Massachusetts, first turning northwest, then minutes later turning south, heading toward New York City. At 8:19 a.m., Betty Ong, a flight attendant on Flight 11, contacts American Airlines personnel by phone, saying she believes the plane is being hijacked and that they no longer have access to the cockpit.
The cockpit's not answering. Somebody's stabbed in business class, and we can't breathe. I don't know. I think we're getting hijacked.
She reports that 2 minutes earlier, a passenger had been stabbed with a knife. According to the final report, this happened because he tried to stop the hijacking. That passenger was Daniel M. Lewin, who had served for 4 years in the Israeli military. He was the first fatal victim of the day. A minute later, at 8:20 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 takes off 10 minutes late from Washington Dulles International Airport, also headed to Los Angeles. This time, the aircraft was a Boeing 757 with 58 passengers and a crew of 6. On board were 5 hijackers. At 8:21 a.m., Flight 11 turns off its transponder, the system that provides aircraft location data to air traffic controllers. At that moment, the plane disappears from the radar. 3 minutes later, Mohammed Atta, one of the hijackers on Flight 11, accidentally alerts Boston air traffic controllers about the hijacking. He had intended to press the button to talk to the passengers, but mistakenly broadcasted over radio saying,
"Nobody move. Everything is okay. If you try to make any move, you'll injure yourself and the airplane. Let's stay quiet. Nobody move, please. We are going back to the airport. Don't try to make any stupid moves."
At 8:32 a.m., Madeline Amy Sweeney, a flight attendant on Flight 11, contacts ground staff at Boston Airport to report the situation. She states that she saw one of the hijackers with an explosive. 2 minutes later, Mohammed Atta, the same hijacker who had previously made the unintentional radio transmission, sends another radio message, which is again heard openly over air traffic communications. Curiously, one of these messages is heard by the pilot of Flight 175, who informs the FAA just minutes later his own plane would also be hijacked. At 8:37 a.m., after hearing Atta's transmission on Flight 11, Boston informs the Northeast Air Defense Sector of the U.S. Air Force, and they begin mobilizing the Air National Guard to follow the aircraft with fighter jets. At 8:42 a.m., United Airlines Flight 93 takes off 42 minutes late from Newark Airport, just across from New York, heading to San Francisco International Airport. The aircraft is a Boeing 757 with 37 passengers, a crew of 7, and 4 hijackers on board. At the same moment, Flight 175 is hijacked over northwestern New Jersey, approximately 100 kilometers northwest of New York City, and changes course toward the city. It also turns off its transponder, disappearing from the radar. At this point, Flight 11 is descending toward New York. 4 minutes later, at 8:46 a.m., Flight 11 crashes into the north face of the North Tower of the World Trade Center. The impact occurs between floors 93 and 99. All passengers on board die instantly, along with an unknown number of people inside the building. The speed of the aircraft at the time of impact was approximately 895 kilometers per hour. The crash causes fires in the North Tower, and the airplane's fuel pours down elevator shafts, igniting fireballs that explode on multiple floors below the impact zone, including the lobby. The collision also severs all 3 emergency stairwells, trapping hundreds of people above the 91st floor. Firefighters and police immediately begin to mobilize toward the area, but there is still confusion. No one really knows what is happening, and the seriousness of the situation remains unclear. At the same minute that Flight 11 hits the North Tower, 2 F-15s are ordered to scramble from Otis Air Force Base to search for that same aircraft. Since the plane's transponder was off, they did not know its location, nor that it was the plane that had already crashed. At 8:50 a.m., just 4 minutes after the first impact, U.S. President George W. Bush is preparing to enter an elementary school in Florida. At that exact moment, Flight 77 is being hijacked over southern Ohio, turning southeast. Its transponder is also turned off, causing it to disappear from the radar. At 8:55 a.m., just 9 minutes after the impact on the North Tower, workers in the South Tower are told that the building is secure and that despite the North Tower being on fire, they should return to their offices. Meanwhile, President Bush is informed that a small plane has crashed into the North Tower, but is told that it appears to be an accident, so everything continues as normal. At 8:59 a.m., the evacuation of both towers is ordered. A minute later, the evacuation order is extended to all civilians within the World Trade Center complex. At 9 a.m., Brian David Sweeney, a passenger on Flight 175, leaves a voicemail for his wife.
Jules, this is Brian. Listen, on an airplane that's been hijacked, and things don't go well, and it's not looking good. I just want you to know I absolutely love you. I want you to do good. So have a good time. Same to my parents and everybody. And I just totally love you, and I'll see you later.
The next thing he does is call his mother and speak to her. At 9:03 a.m., Flight 175 crashes into the south face of the South Tower of the World Trade Center, hitting between the 77th and 85th floors at a speed of 950 kilometers per hour. All passengers and crew die instantly. Some parts of the aircraft, including the right engine, fly out of the building and land 6 blocks away. According to witnesses who were in the lower part of the South Tower at the moment of impact, they felt a tremendous jolt. They thought the other tower had collapsed, but it was their own that had been struck by a second plane. At 9:05 a.m., President George W. Bush is sitting in a classroom at the Florida school when he is interrupted and told, "A second plane hit the second tower. America is under attack." Bush later wrote about his reaction, which was recorded on video. "I decided not to get up immediately and leave the room. I didn't want to alarm the children. I wanted to project a sense of calm. I had been in enough crisis situations to know that the first thing a leader must do is project calm." At 9:28 a.m., Flight 93 is hijacked over northern Ohio, turning southeast. At the moment the hijackers enter the cockpit, Cleveland air traffic controllers hear it over the radio. At 9:29 a.m., President Bush addresses the nation in a live broadcast from the school, in front of about 200 teachers and students. At 9:32 a.m., a radio transmission from Flight 93 is heard by Cleveland controllers. The pilot was speaking to the passengers when he said, "Ladies and gentlemen, this is the captain. Please remain seated. We have a bomb on board, so stay seated. This is of vital importance, as you'll discover in a few minutes." At 9:36 a.m., the vice president is taken to the security bunker beneath the White House, as there is concern that he himself may be a target. A minute later, at 9:37 a.m., American Airlines Flight 77 crashes into the west side of the Pentagon at 837 kilometers per hour. All 59 passengers and crew on board lose their lives in the impact. In addition to those on board, the crash caused the deaths of 125 people on the ground, including emergency workers. The impact triggered a violent fire that began to spread throughout the Pentagon building. At 9:39 a.m., the hijacker controlling Flight 93 turns off the transponder and once again tells the passengers to stay calm because he has a bomb. At 9:42 a.m., the airspace over the United States is closed by the FAA. All operating aircraft are ordered to land at the nearest airport, and international flights are banned from entering U.S. airspace. From Canada, Operation Yellow Ribbon is launched to help clear U.S. skies. At 9:45 a.m., the White House and the Capitol building begin evacuation procedures, fearing another possible attack. At 9:55 a.m., Air Force One, with President George W. Bush on board, takes off from Florida. At 9:57 a.m., the passengers aboard Flight 93 begin a revolt, organized by Todd Beamer, Mark Bingham, Tom Burnett, Jeremy Glick, and others. They confront the hijackers in an attempt to regain control of the plane. At 9:59 a.m., the South Tower of the World Trade Center collapses just 56 minutes after impact. At 10:03 a.m., Flight 93 crashes deliberately into the ground, directed by the hijackers during a struggle in the cockpit as passengers attempted to retake the plane. The crash site was about 130 kilometers, 80 miles, southeast of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, approximately 20 minutes from Washington, D.C. Later reports suggest the passengers had learned of the other attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon, and were almost certain they would suffer the same fate. It is believed that the intended target of this flight was either the U.S. Capitol or the White House, but Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, the principal architect of the attacks, later confirmed that the Capitol building was the main target. This was known because he was captured by Pakistani intelligence and handed over to the United States. He also said that all hijackers had been ordered to crash the plane if they could not reach their target. At 10:15 a.m., a section of the west face of the Pentagon collapses. At 10:20 a.m., President Bush authorizes the military to shoot down any aircraft that had not yet landed. By that time, all 4 hijacked planes had already crashed, but the president's team still believed Flight 93 was in the air. At 10:28 a.m., the North Tower of the World Trade Center collapses, 1 hour and 42 minutes after the impact of Flight 11. The Marriott Hotel, located at the base of the 2 towers, is also destroyed. At 10:50 a.m., all 5 floors of the Pentagon's West Wing, where Flight 77 had crashed, collapse due to the fire. 3 minutes later, at 10:53 a.m., Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld orders the U.S. military to go to a higher state of alert, DEFCON 3. The DEFCON system is the U.S. military alert level. DEFCON 5, normal readiness. DEFCON 4, increased intelligence and security measures. DEFCON 3, armed forces on high alert. Air Force personnel must be ready to deploy within 15 minutes. DEFCON 2, military ready for combat within 6 hours. DEFCON 1, nuclear war. A few minutes later, at 11:45 a.m., Air Force One lands at Barksdale Air Force Base in Louisiana. Half an hour later, at 12:16 p.m., U.S. airspace is completely cleared of all commercial and private aircraft. In just 2.5 hours, the airspace was fully emptied. At 1:30 p.m., Air Force One departs Barksdale, with the president on board, headed to Offutt Air Force Base in Nebraska, which has a bunker capable of withstanding a nuclear attack. That day, authorities considered the possibility that the president himself was a target, and that there could be infiltrators within the Secret Service, because a message was received referring to the president as Angel, the Secret Service code name for the president. This raised concerns that they had a mole inside, which is why the president was moved from one base to another. In the end, nothing happened, And at 4:30 p.m., Air Force One departs Offutt and heads back toward Andrews Air Force Base near Washington, D.C., from where the president would travel to the White House by helicopter. 4 hours later, at 8:30 p.m., President Bush addresses the nation. That morning will be remembered for centuries, not only because of the victims, but because the safety of civilians and national leaders was put in jeopardy. Security procedures were improved after that day, and aviation changed forever. With the number of events that took place, many of which we've just gone through, it's possible you may have missed a few key points. First of all, the flights selected for the attacks were scheduled to take off almost simultaneously. The goal was for the impacts to happen nearly at the same time, leaving virtually zero reaction time. The fact that the flights were delayed turned out to be crucial because of the 17-minute gap between the two towers being hit when the first tower was already burning. All cameras were focused on it. And then, suddenly, the second plane hit. That 17-minute delay meant the entire world saw the second impact live. Another decisive factor caused by the delays was that the passengers on Flight 93 learned about the other attacks while still on the plane. When they realized their flight had also been hijacked, they understood that their fate would likely be the same, so they decided to fight for their lives. And today, they are remembered as heroes. Many people doubt this version of events and believe the plane was simply shot down. The black boxes, which contain the cockpit voice recordings, were released to the public and reveal a struggle between passengers and hijackers right before the crash. Of course, I'm aware these recordings could have been faked, but there's also the fact that the president gave the green light to shoot down any aircraft that had not landed. It wouldn't make much sense to give that order, make it public, and then try to hide the fact that a plane was shot down. Additionally, there were several fighter pilots scrambled to intercept Flight 93. The reason they didn't shoot it down is because they couldn't find it. It had already crashed. There is an interview with two of those pilots where they openly talk about the mission. Each of them was flying an F-16, and on that day they were unarmed, conducting training missions. So when they were ordered to intercept Flight 93, they realized their only way to stop it was to ram the hijacked plane themselves. And they say this openly. Another critical point from that day is that the vice president was moved to the White House bunker just 1 minute before Flight 77 hit the Pentagon, which means that if the plane had hit the White House instead, it could have killed the vice president, or worse. It wasn't until after Flight 77 struck the Pentagon that the Capitol was evacuated, which means that had the plane crashed into the Capitol, it could have wiped out a large portion of the nation's politicians. Lastly, I won't ignore the fact that many aspects of the attacks are strange, but that takes us into motives and who stood to benefit. And this video was meant to be a timeline of what we do know for sure happened. 4 planes took off at certain times, with dozens of passengers, and crashed minutes later. And that is a fact.